Have you ever noticed that when you finish the Old Testament and start the New, it feels like you've jumped into a completely different world? Suddenly, there are Pharisees, Sadducees, synagogues, and the Roman Empire is in charge. What happened in between? Well, that gap is often called the 400 silent years because there were no new prophetic scriptures from God. But trust me, these years were anything but silent. They were packed with dramatic political shifts, cultural clashes, and religious developments that set the stage perfectly for Jesus' arrival. Let's dive into this fascinating period. Our story begins around 400 BC, at the end of the Old Testament. The Jewish people had returned from their exile in Babylon and rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, all under the rule of the vast Persian Empire. The Persians were actually pretty tolerant rulers. They allowed the Jews to practice their religion freely and govern their local affairs. Life was relatively stable. The high priest was the main authority in Jerusalem, and people gathered to study the Torah, which was becoming more central to Jewish identity than ever before. This period of relative peace allowed Jewish culture and faith to solidify after the trauma of exile. But then, the world changed. In the 330s BC, a young, brilliant general from Macedonia named Alexander the Great swept across the globe. He conquered the Persian Empire with breathtaking speed, and Judea, the land of the Jews, fell under his control. Alexander wasn't just a conqueror, he was a visionary. He dreamed of a world united by Greek culture, language, and ideas, a process we now call Hellenization. He founded cities everywhere, the most famous being Alexandria in Egypt, which became a major center of learning and culture, and also home to a huge Jewish population. After Alexander's sudden death, his massive empire was torn apart by his generals, the Diadochi. For the next century and a half, Judea was caught in a tug-of-war between two of these successor kingdoms, the Ptolemies based in Egypt and the Seleucids based in Syria. Initially, the Ptolemies ruled Judea, and like the Persians, they were mostly hands-off, allowing the Jews to maintain their customs. It was during this time, in Alexandria, that a monumental project was undertaken, the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. This translation, known as the Septuagint, was a game-changer. It made the Jewish faith accessible to a wider, Greek-speaking world and would later become the primary Old Testament text used by the early Christian church. However, around 200 BC, the Seleucids wrestled control of Judea from the Ptolemies, and things took a dark turn. One Seleucid king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, was determined to stamp out Judaism completely. He wasn't just encouraging Hellenization, he was forcing it. He declared himself Epiphanes, which means God manifest, and demanded to be worshipped. In 167 BC, he committed the ultimate sacrilege. He desecrated the temple in Jerusalem by sacrificing a pig on the altar and setting up a statue of Zeus. He outlawed circumcision, Sabbath observance, and possession of the Torah, punishing disobedience with death. This brutal persecution sparked a full-blown rebellion. It was led by an elderly priest named Mattathias, and his 5 sons, most notably Judas, who was nicknamed Maccabeus, meaning the hammer. This small band of Jewish freedom fighters, known as the Maccabees, launched a guerrilla war against the mighty Seleucid army. Against all odds, through faith and fierce determination, they drove the Seleucids out, and in 164 BC, they triumphantly recaptured Jerusalem. They cleansed and rededicated the temple, an event that is still celebrated today by Jewish people with the festival of Hanukkah. This victory led to the establishment of an independent Jewish kingdom for the first time in centuries, ruled by the descendants of Mattathias, known as the Hasmonean dynasty. For about 100 years, Judea was self-governing. It was during this intense period of conflict and independence that different Jewish religious groups, or sects, really came into focus. The Pharisees emerged as a group of laypeople deeply devoted to observing not just the written Torah, but also the oral traditions. They believed in the resurrection, angels, and were very influential among the common people. On the other hand, the Sadducees were the wealthy, aristocratic priestly class. They were more politically powerful, controlled the temple, and only accepted the written Torah, rejecting ideas like the resurrection. There were also the Essenes, a more mystical group who often withdrew from society into desert communities, like the one at Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, waiting for God's intervention. But the Hasmonean dynasty eventually crumbled due to internal power struggles. Their infighting created a power vacuum, and a new, rising superpower was waiting in the wings: Rome. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem and put an end to Jewish independence. Judea became a province of the Roman Empire. The Romans installed their own puppet kings, the most famous being Herod the Great, a brilliant but ruthless builder who massively expanded the Second Temple, the very temple Jesus would walk in. And that brings us to the threshold of the New Testament. The 400 silent years were over. The world was now dominated by Rome, ensuring a common language and a network of roads that would later help the gospel spread. The Greek language, thanks to Alexander, was spoken everywhere, allowing the New Testament to be written and read across the empire. And within Judaism itself, the intense debates between Pharisees and Sadducees, the longing for a Messiah, and the centrality of the temple and synagogues created the exact religious and cultural landscape into which Jesus of Nazareth was born. These years weren't silent. They were God's meticulous preparation of the world for the arrival of His Son. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more content. See you next time.